Hello, and welcome back to American Shadows, the place where we walk through the darkened hallways of history and uncover the chilling truths that lie dormant in the heart of the nation. Before we step into the manicured lawns and behind the closed doors of today's story, I want to share something that happened to me last week. I was visiting my grandmother in her small, quiet town in rural Ohio. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name, where screen doors are left unlocked, and the biggest news is the county fair's prize-winning pumpkin. While I was there, an old family friend, Mr. Abernathy, passed away. He was 92. The whole town came out for his funeral. They didn't talk about his wealth or his career. They talked about how he always had a kind word, how he fixed neighborhood kids' bicycles for free, how his garden was a riot of color every spring. It was a beautiful, solemn reminder that behind every face, every house, every seemingly ordinary life, there is a complex story of love, loss, and community. But sometimes, that story is not one of warmth and fond remembrance. Sometimes, the story hidden behind the perfect facade is a nightmare of secrets and lies. Sometimes, the most peaceful-looking places harbor the most violent darkness. The case we are about to explore is one such story. It's a story that reminds us that the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows. This is the story of the Beaumont family and the massacre at Havenwood Creek. It's a long and winding road, so settle in. And if you appreciate these deep dives into the cases that America has tried to forget, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps us continue to bring these important, and often terrifying, stories to light. Now let's begin. The town of Havenwood Creek, Connecticut, was less a place and more a meticulously curated postcard. Nestled in a verdant valley, it was an enclave of old money and new tech fortunes, a place where sprawling colonial mansions with perfectly manicured lawns were separated by ancient stone walls and whispering oak trees. Crime was a concept residents read about in the New York Times, an abstract problem for other, less fortunate places. The police department's most frequent calls were for lost pedigree dogs or minor fender benders involving a Tesla and a vintage Jaguar. That all changed on the cold, crisp morning of October 12th. The call came into the 911 dispatch at 7:04 a.m. The voice on the other end was frantic, choked with sobs, barely coherent. It was Maria, the Beaumont family's live-in housekeeper for over 20 years. She had arrived for her morning duties to find something unspeakable. Detective Miles Corrigan felt the familiar, bitter taste of bile rise in his throat as he ducked under the yellow tape. At 48, with a face etched by too many sleepless nights and a soul weighed down by the ghosts of 1,000 grim crime scenes, Corrigan had thought he was immune to shock. He was wrong. The Beaumont estate was the crown jewel of Havenwood Creek. A magnificent white Georgian mansion set on 10 acres of rolling hills, complete with a tennis court, a pool house, and a garden that looked like it had been lifted from the pages of a magazine. But the beauty of the exterior was a grotesque mockery of the horror within. The foyer was a cathedral of marble and mahogany, with a grand staircase spiraling towards the second floor. At the base of that staircase lay the body of Richard Beaumont, a titan of industry, a man whose steely gaze on the cover of Forbes had projected an aura of invincibility, now lay in a pool of his own congealing blood. He had been shot multiple times. His expensive suit was ruined, his eyes wide open, locked in a final, silent expression of disbelief. Corrigan's younger partner, Detective Isabella Rossi, was already inside, her face pale but her expression professionally stoic. Rossi was everything Corrigan was not: young, tech-savvy, a firm believer in data and procedure over gut feelings. They were an odd pair, but an effective one. "Upstairs is worse, Miles," she said, her voice low and steady, a deliberate effort to keep the horror at bay. He nodded, his gaze sweeping the room. No signs of forced entry. The antique grandfather clock against the wall was still ticking, its gentle chime a surreal counterpoint to the carnage. He followed Rossi up the sweeping staircase, his shoes covered in protective booties, careful to avoid the crimson droplets that marred the plush ivory runner. The master bedroom was at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. Inside, Eleanor Beaumont, a woman renowned for her philanthropy and effortless elegance, was dead in her bed. Like her husband, she had been shot. A half-finished glass of water sat on her nightstand next to a volume of poetry. It was a scene of domestic tranquility violently interrupted. The worst, however, was across the hall. In a room decorated with pastel colors, ballet posters, and academic awards, lay Chloe Beaumont. At 17, she was the golden child, the high school valedictorian, the future Yale student. She was found at her desk, slumped over an open textbook, a single, devastating gunshot wound to her head. It was an execution. An act of such profound cruelty it felt personal. 3 victims, Rossi stated, documenting the scene with her tablet. Richard, 52. Eleanor, 50. Chloe, 17. All shot. Looks like a small caliber weapon, maybe a .22 suppressed. The killer was efficient. No shell casings immediately visible. Forensics is on its way to do a full sweep. Corrigan didn't answer. He was staring at Chloe's desk. Amidst the blood and the shattered dreams, one thing was out of place. A single, perfect, white orchid, sitting in a small porcelain vase, was positioned neatly on the corner of the desk. It was completely untouched by the violence. There was no blood on its petals, no disturbance to the water in its vase. Felt, placed, deliberate, a signature. What about the son? Corrigan asked, his voice a low growl. The family has a son, right? Ethan. He's 19, a sophomore at the university. His room is down the hall. It's empty, Rossi confirmed. Bed hasn't been slept in. We've put out a bolo for him and his vehicle, a dark gray Audi. Either he's our 4th victim, or he's our primary suspect. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The media circus began before the first body bag was zipped. Havenwood Creek was a national story now. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs lined the winding country road leading to the estate, their cameras aimed like sniper rifles at the gates. The perfect postcard had been torn, burned, and trampled. For the next 12 hours, the Beaumont mansion was a hive of activity. Forensic technicians in white suits moved with quiet, grim purpose, dusting for prints, collecting fibers, analyzing blood spatter patterns. Corrigan and Rossi began the arduous task of piecing together the last hours of the Beaumonts' lives. They learned that Richard Beaumont had been under immense professional pressure. His tech empire, once thought unassailable, was facing a hostile takeover, and rumors of financial irregularities were swirling. This opened up a long list of potential enemies. Business rivals, disgruntled investors, fired employees. Eleanor Beaumont, while publicly poised, had a private life shrouded in whispers. There were rumors of a discreet affair, of a battle with depression masked by charity galas and social obligations. Chloe was, by all accounts, perfect. Straight A's, captain of the debate team, beloved by her peers. But digging deeper, they found a therapist she had been secretly seeing for anxiety. The pressure to be a Beaumont was, it seemed, a heavy burden. Every lead, however, was a dead end. Richard's rivals had ironclad alibis. Eleanor's rumored lover was on a business trip in Singapore. Chloe's therapist was bound by patient confidentiality but hinted at overwhelming familial expectations. The house's security system had been disabled from the inside at 10:47 p.m. the previous night. The disabling code was one known only to the 4 family members. Then, at 8:15 p.m., a break. A state trooper found a dark gray Audi abandoned on the shoulder of a service road 20 miles away. The car was unlocked, the keys in the ignition. There was no sign of its driver. Panic began to set in. Had Ethan Beaumont been kidnapped by his family's killers? Was he wandering in the woods, injured and terrified? A massive search operation was launched, with helicopters, K-9 units, and dozens of officers combing the dense forest. Corrigan, however, wasn't convinced. The abandoned car felt too neat, too staged. He stood in the incident command center, a map of the search area spread out before him, but his mind was back in Chloe's bedroom, staring at that pristine white orchid. It was a message. But what was it saying? Peace? Purity? A farewell? It was Rossi who found the next piece. She had been tirelessly sifting through the family's digital footprint. "Miles, you need to see this," she called from her desk, her voice taut with excitement. "I've been going through the home's cloud server. Most of the security footage from the internal cameras was wiped. But not all of it. The killer missed one. A small, motion-activated camera in the back hallway, aimed at the mudroom door leading to the garage. It's low-res, but it's something." She played the clip on her monitor. The timestamp read 11:03 p.m. The back door opened. A figure, slim and tall, dressed in dark clothing with a hood pulled low, slipped out of the house and into the garage. The figure moved with a quiet, familiar confidence. There was no hesitation. The face was obscured, but the height, the gait. It was consistent with a young man. The figure was carrying a small, dark duffel bag. 30 seconds later, the garage door opened, and the headlights of the Audi swept across the driveway before the car pulled out and disappeared into the night. "He left after the estimated time of the murders," Corrigan murmured, leaning closer to the screen. The timeline was tightening. The killer wasn't a stranger who broke in. They were someone who was already inside. Someone who knew the house, knew the codes. The search for Ethan Beaumont intensified, but the narrative had subtly shifted. He was no longer just a potential victim. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle for Chapter 1 fell into place just after midnight. A call came in from a small, 24-hour diner 50 miles north of Havenwood Creek. A waitress, having seen the news, recognized a young man who had been sitting in a corner booth for hours, nursing a single cup of coffee. He was pale, his eyes wide and vacant, his expensive clothes disheveled. When the local police arrived, the young man didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just stared into the distance, as if watching a movie only he could see. It was Ethan Beaumont. He was physically unharmed. When they asked him where he had been, he finally looked at them, his expression a hollow mask of grief. I was at a friend's house," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Studying. I just heard. I just saw the news. My family. Oh God, my family." He broke down, collapsing into sobs that seemed to shake his entire body. It was a performance of profound, heart-wrenching anguish. The officers on the scene saw a traumatized young man who had just lost everything. But Detective Miles Corrigan, watching the bodycam footage later that morning, saw something else. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible delay before the tears came. He saw the way Ethan's eyes flickered, just for a second, towards the officer's camera, and he felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. The boy wasn't just a victim, he was the sole survivor. And in cases like this, the sole survivor was always where you started. The interview was set for the following day. As Corrigan prepared his questions, he couldn't shake the image of the white orchid, sitting serenely amidst a scene of unimaginable violence. It was a symbol of perfection in a room of death, a chilling testament to the perfect facade of a family that had, in the end, been utterly destroyed from within. The biggest question was no longer who killed the Beaumonts, but why. And Corrigan had a terrible feeling that the answer was sitting in a police station holding room, wrapped in a blanket and playing the part of the grieving son. The interrogation room was a sterile, gray box, designed to strip away comfort and pretense. Ethan Beaumont sat at the small metal table, a ghost in an oversized police-issue sweatsuit. The raw grief he had displayed at the diner had subsided, replaced by a fragile, vacant calm. He looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and hastily glued back together, the cracks still visible just beneath the surface. "Ethan, I'm Detective Corrigan, and this is Detective Rossi," Miles began, his voice deliberately gentle. "We are so sorry for your loss. We're here to find the person who did this to your family." Ethan nodded, not making eye contact. He stared at a scuff mark on the table as if it held the secrets of the universe. "I was at my friend's place, Josh Miller. We were cramming for a midterm. My phone was off so we wouldn't get distracted. I didn't know anything was wrong until I stopped for coffee on my way home and saw my dad's face on the TV. His story was plausible, clean. Josh Miller, when contacted, confirmed it. Ethan was at his dorm from 7 p.m. until around 6 a.m. They studied, ordered a pizza, played some video games. Josh was a reliable witness. The alibi was solid. Almost too solid. "You left Josh's at 6 a.m.? Rossi asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "The diner where you were found is 50 miles in the opposite direction from Havenwood Creek. Why were you headed north?" Ethan's eyes flickered. I just needed to drive. To clear my head. I couldn't face going home just yet. I was exhausted. It was a small inconsistency, but it was a crack. Corrigan chose not to press it. Not yet. Instead, he steered the conversation towards the family itself. "Tell us about your family, Ethan. Was everything okay at home? Any problems? Anyone who might have held a grudge against your father?" For the first time, a spark of emotion ignited in Ethan's vacant eyes. "A grudge? Detective, my father was Richard Beaumont. People were either inspired by him or jealous of him. His list of enemies was probably as long as his list of accomplishments." He delivered the line with a touch of cynical pride, the son of a king speaking of the realm. He detailed his father's cutthroat business dealings, the recent hostile takeover bid led by a ruthless rival named Marcus Thorne, the threats from a recently fired COO. He painted a portrait of a powerful, demanding patriarch. When asked about his mother, his tone softened. "She was graceful. She held everything together. She was the calm in my father's storm. And Chloe?" A sad smile touched his lips. "She was perfect. Annoyingly perfect. She never got a B in her life. Dad called her his star." The interview lasted 2 hours. Ethan was composed, articulate, and helpful. He gave them names, timelines, and potential motives for outsiders. But throughout it all, Corrigan felt a profound sense of detachment from the young man. He spoke of his murdered family as if they were characters in a novel he had read. The grief felt rehearsed, the details too polished. As the days turned into a week, the investigation split into 2 parallel tracks. Rossi, a master of data and detail, led the outsider theory. She and her team delved into Richard Beaumont's chaotic financial world. They uncovered a mountain of debt hidden behind a shell corporation. The Beaumont empire was a house of cards, on the verge of collapse. Richard had made promises he couldn't keep and enemies who had lost fortunes because of him. Marcus Thorne, his chief business rival, had a particularly potent motive and a questionable alibi for the night of the murders. He became a person of interest. Corrigan, meanwhile, pursued the insider theory, a path he walked mostly alone. He couldn't shake the image of the white orchid. It felt like a gesture of intimacy, not the calling card of a corporate hitman. He started digging into the family's private life, peeling back the layers of the perfect facade. He discovered that Eleanor Beaumont had been receiving treatment for a severe anxiety disorder for years. Her psychiatrist, speaking to Corrigan off the record, described her as a woman living in a gilded cage, terrified of her husband's temper and despondent over her inability to connect with her children. Her grace was a carefully constructed mask. He found Chloe's private journal, tucked away in a shoebox at the back of her closet. The entries were heartbreaking. They spoke of crippling pressure, of her father's relentless demands for perfection, of her fear of never being good enough. One entry was particularly chilling. "Dad says Ethan is a disappointment. He says I am the only one who can carry the Beaumont name. So heavy. Sometimes I wish I could just disappear." The perfect family was a myth. It was a pressure cooker of ambition, disappointment, and quiet desperation. And Ethan was at the center of it. Corrigan focused on him. He re-interviewed Josh Miller, Ethan's alibi. Josh was nervous. He stuck to his story, but his body language screamed discomfort. "Look, detective," he finally admitted. "Ethan is my friend, but he's been different lately, intense. He talks a lot about philosophy, about freeing oneself from expectations. It was kind of weird." The real breakthrough came from the digital forensics team. They had been working on the family's computers. Ethan's laptop was initially clean, but a deep-level data recovery specialist found fragments of a wiped hard drive. What he recovered turned the case on its head. In the weeks leading up to the murders, someone using Ethan's laptop had made a series of disturbing Google searches. How to disable Havenwood residential security systems. Best caliber for silent home defense. Gun suppressors. Legal purchase, Connecticut. Psychology of the family annihilator. How to defeat a GSR, gunshot residue, test. And most damningly, a week before the killings, a search for where to buy white orchids near Havenwood Creek. Rossi stared at the report, her face ashen. My God, Miles, the alibi. The alibi was a lie, Corrigan finished, his voice grim. Josh Miller is covering for him, either out of loyalty or fear. They brought Josh in again. This time, faced with a potential charge of obstruction of justice, his story crumbled. The truth was far more sinister. Ethan came to my dorm that night, but it wasn't at 7 p.m., Josh confessed, his voice trembling. It was after midnight, closer to 1 a.m. He looked wild. His eyes were wide. He said his car broke down and his phone was dead. Asked if he could crash on my couch. He made me promise not to tell anyone he'd come in so late. He said his dad would kill him for being out past curfew. I had no idea. I swear, I had no idea. The timeline had shattered. Ethan had no alibi for the time of the murders. The video of him leaving the house at 11:03 p.m. was no longer a mystery. He had committed the murders and then driven to his friend's dorm to build a false timeline. Corrigan and Rossi went to the university to arrest Ethan Beaumont. They found him not in his dorm, but in the campus library, calmly reading a book on Kantian ethics. When he saw the detectives approaching, he didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. He slowly closed his book, marked his page, and stood up. He didn't say a word as they cuffed him. The news that the golden boy, the grieving son, was the prime suspect sent a seismic shockwave through Havenwood Creek and the nation. The media narrative shifted instantly from a tragic family massacre to the story of a patricidal monster. Marcus Thorne was cleared, and the full, horrifying weight of the investigation fell upon Ethan. But in the interrogation room, he remained silent. He requested a lawyer and refused to answer any questions. He sat for hours, perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He had retreated behind a wall of silence that seemed impenetrable. Corrigan knew that a confession was crucial. The digital evidence was strong, but circumstantial. A smart defense attorney could create reasonable doubt. They could argue the searches were for a school paper, that another family member could have used the laptop. They needed Ethan to talk. For days, Corrigan sat with him, trying different approaches. He was aggressive. He was sympathetic. He was logical. Nothing worked. Ethan was a stone wall. It was as if the articulate, grieving young man from the first interview had never existed, replaced by this silent, empty shell. Corrigan was running out of time and options. The DA was pushing for a charge, but he knew the case was vulnerable without a confession. He spent a sleepless night rereading Chloe's journal, trying to understand the crushing weight of being a Beaumont. He thought about the pressure, the silence, the desperation. The next morning, he walked into the interrogation room with a new strategy. He didn't bring a case file or photos of the crime scene. He brought 2 cups of coffee and a single, perfect white orchid in a small vase. He placed it on the table between them. He sat down and said nothing, just looked at the flower. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the hum of the ventilation system. Finally, Ethan's eyes, which had been fixed on the wall, drifted down to the orchid. His mask of indifference began to crack. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. "Why the orchid, Ethan?" Corrigan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Everyone else wants to know how. I want to know why. Why the orchid for Chloe?" The question hung in the silent room. Ethan's shoulders began to shake, and a low, guttural sob escaped his lips. The wall had been breached. The perfect facade was about to come crashing down for the last time. The white orchid sat on the cold steel table, its petals a stark, luminous white against the oppressive gray of the interrogation room. It seemed to absorb all the light, a silent testament to a secret only 2 people in the room understood. Ethan Beaumont stared at it, his composure finally shattered. The tears that fell were not the performative sobs of a grieving victim. They were the ragged, agonizing tears of a soul that had been holding itself together with nothing but pressure and lies. Corrigan didn't speak. He waited. He had learned over his long career that silence was the most powerful tool in a room like this. It demanded to be filled, and sooner or later, the truth would rush in to fill the vacuum. She loved them. Ethan finally whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. When we were kids, before my father. Before he decided I wasn't enough. We had a small greenhouse. Mom loved her roses, but Chloe and we loved the orchids. They were our secret. We would pretend they were exotic creatures from another planet. Perfect. Flawless. Untouchable. He took a shuddering breath, the memories flooding back, unbidden and painful. Everything in that house had to be perfect. The grades, the sports, the friendships, the smile you wore at the country club. It was a performance. A 24/7 performance, and my father was the director. And he was a tyrant. Corrigan remained quiet, letting him talk. This was it. The confession was starting not with the what or the how, but with the why, the long, slow suffocation that had preceded the violent explosion. He decided when I was about 15 that I was a lost cause. Ethan continued, a bitter, self-loathing edge to his voice. I liked books more than football. I preferred chess to schmoozing with his business partners. I wasn't him. I wasn't the heir he wanted. So he turned all his focus, all that crushing weight, onto Chloe. She became his project. His star. He described a home that was less a sanctuary and more a boardroom. Dinners were debriefings on academic performance. Weekends were for scheduled enrichment activities. Love wasn't given freely. It was a dividend paid out for success. Failure meant the withdrawal of affection, a cold, suffocating silence from their father, and the anxious, fluttering disappointment from their mother. I watched it kill her, Ethan said, his voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper. I saw the light go out of her eyes. She was so tired, so scared of making a mistake. She started having panic attacks. She would hide in her closet, just trying to breathe. And my parents, they just told her to be stronger, to be a Beaumont. The night of the murders was the culmination of it all. Richard had discovered that Ethan was planning to change his major from economics to philosophy. To Richard, it was the ultimate act of defiance, a final confirmation that his son was a failure. He cornered me in his study, Ethan recalled, his eyes locked on a distant, terrible memory. He didn't yell. That wasn't his style. It was worse. He was cold. He told me I was a disgrace. He said he was writing me out of his will, that I was no longer his son. He said I was a parasite on his family's name. Something inside Ethan broke. A wire that had been stretched taut for 19 years finally snapped. He turned his back on me to pour a drink, and all I could see was this endless future of him standing over Chloe, polishing his trophy until she cracked into a million pieces. All I could think was that none of us would ever be free. The gun was a .22 caliber pistol his father kept in the desk drawer. A small, quiet gun for home defense. Ethan didn't even remember taking it out. It was just suddenly in his hand. He didn't even see it coming, Ethan said, a chilling emptiness in his tone. He just fell. It was so quiet, so simple, and for a second there was this silence. The first real silence I had ever felt in that house. The director was gone. He went upstairs. His mother woke up as he entered her room. She looked at him, not with fear, but with a strange, sad recognition. She just looked at me and said, "Oh, Ethan." That's all. Like she knew this was always how it was going to end. He shot her once. He paused, the next part almost impossible to say. Chloe. She was in her room. She was studying, of course. Always studying. She heard the sound, muffled as it was. She turned around. When she saw the gun, she didn't scream. She just looked at me, and I saw it in her eyes. It was relief. Corrigan felt a chill crawl up his spine. She whispered, "Is it over?" And I nodded. Ethan choked out, fresh tears streaming down his face. I promised her it was. That she wouldn't have to be perfect anymore. That she could finally rest. He raised the gun. He said it was the hardest and the easiest thing he had ever done. The orchid. Ethan looked at the flower on the table, his gaze softening. I had bought it a few days before. I was going to give it to her, just to see her smile. To remind her of when we were kids. After she was gone, I put it on her desk. It was my way of saying sorry. And my way of saying, "You're free now. You're perfect. You're untouchable." He then described, in a monotone, detached voice, the rest of his actions. How he wiped down the surfaces he'd touched. How he disabled the security system from his father's main computer. How he took a duffel bag with a change of clothes, the gun, and the laptop's hard drive. He drove to a deserted bridge and threw the bag into the deep, dark water below. Then he drove to Josh's, creating the alibi, setting the stage for the final act of his performance as the grieving son. The confession, once it started, poured out of him for over an hour. It was a horrifying, tragic, and strangely coherent narrative of a boy pushed past the brink. He wasn't a monster born of pure evil, but one created in a crucible of relentless pressure and emotional neglect. The aftermath was a media sensation. The Havenwood horror trial was broadcast live across the nation. The prosecution painted Ethan as a cold, calculating sociopath who murdered his family for a potential inheritance, not knowing they were broke. The defense argued for a form of extreme emotional disturbance, creating a narrative of an abused boy who snapped. In the end, the jury didn't see an abused child. They saw a young man who had executed his entire family. Ethan Beaumont was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Havenwood Creek never recovered. The perfect postcard was gone forever, replaced by a permanent stain. The Beaumont mansion was sold, but no one ever lived in it again. It stood empty on the hill, a monument to a dark secret, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a town that had been forced to confront the ugliness it had tried so hard to keep hidden. For Detective Miles Corrigan, the case was a victory, but it felt like a profound loss. He had gotten his confession, he had closed the case. But the chilling logic of Ethan's motive haunted him. He saw the Beaumonts not just as victims, but as co-architects of their own destruction. Months later, on a bleak winter afternoon, Corrigan found himself driving down the old country road that led past the Beaumont estate. He pulled his car over and looked up at the great silent house. He thought about the pressure, the perfection, the terrible weight of a name. And he thought about a pristine white orchid, a final, heartbreaking symbol of a love that could only be expressed through an act of unimaginable violence. He started his car and drove away, leaving the shadows of Havenwood Creek behind him, but knowing they would follow him for the rest of his days.